Greetings and welcome to The Other Side. This Tuesday we're going to be discussing an interesting topic, but before we get to that topic, you may have recognized that we've had a format change with The Other Side, and Kenny and I would like to discuss with you what it is that we're doing, maybe a little of the why, so that you can understand. You've been a very supportive audience with the program, The Other Side. We started about 6 months ago. It's very interactive, but we decided to make some format changes to improve the program. We're bringing in some very interesting speakers, and we need a lot of time to be able to dissect the details of the issues. And we felt, and actually we got a lot of feedback from different callers, that we were shortchanging them on information, vital information from these presenters. So we decided to move away from the normal talk show format where you invite people to jump in early in the program and just express opinions. Opinions are important, but sometimes they don't add value to a conversation because maybe they come from places and people who may not have a lot of information, yet they have very strong opinions, and that's fine. But I think, and Kenny will agree with this, maybe you can talk to this on this briefly, Kenny, that it would be add more value to the very important topics that we need to understand so that we can progress as a society if we had stronger content and less opinions from callers calling in. We still want to hear your opinions, so there is a way in which you can make your voices heard with the program, The Other Side of the Story. You can actually, follow us on Facebook. You can follow our YouTube channel, and you can send in your comments on Facebook, and we will take it up. We're not saying we're not interested in your comments. We're very interested in your comments, but we just think that the audience, the audience, deserve more information, and that's really what we're out to present. So Kenny, maybe you can just chime in, and then we will just roll on to the program. This evening we have a very, very, very important presenter. I'm sure you will be delighted with what you hear. He's very knowledgeable on an issue of the day, which is on the cannabis trade. Where do we go as a country? This is much discussed, and there's a lot of emotion whenever you discuss cannabis one way or the other. Where are we going with respect to the industry? Where are we going with the regulations? And we have the top, probably, I would say the top, consultant in the region that will speak to this. And so, Kenny, maybe you can just chime in, and then we can jump right into the program.
Yes, Sam, I concur with everything that you've said. And I want to reiterate that the feedback that we've gotten is what has driven the change from where we were before, from a talk show format into a podcast format, where you have more content, you get a chance to listen as a listener and to opine on it in retrospect via either Facebook or YouTube. That format means also that contributors feel a lot more comfortable about spending time because they get more time, Sam, to be able to articulate themselves and articulate their thoughts. And I am pretty sure that in the show tonight, for this show in particular on cannabis, that our guest is going to open up a lot of minds and create a lot of ideas and give you a sense of why we chose to have this format in this way. Going forward, I think we're not just going to see more regional and international policymakers come on board because there's interest, but we're also going to see a more nuanced, a more balanced approach to the topics that we choose. I think we want to get away from topics that produce rancor and produce differences and choose more topics where people can learn and people can actually talk across lines about opportunities and, yes, challenges. So that's going to be something going forward for all of us.
So, our friends, we're asking you to do what you've done over the past 6 months, is to listen up, stick with us. We're here to bring information to you. Kenny and I are business people, but we just think it's important that we have, meaningful conversations on topics and inform the public on topics so that as a community we can make better and stronger decisions. So again, that's what The Other Side of the Story is about. We changed it from just the other side to the other side of the story, and we'll keep making modest changes. So just stick with us. Send in your recommendations. Let us know how you feel about the changes. Let us know how you feel about some of the topics and so on, and we will be glad to incorporate your comments and your feedback in our questions to our guests, and also in to respond just generally to the issues that have concerned you. So welcome to the other side, and now we're going to flow right into this evening's program. Today we are going to be diving into a very interesting topic, which is cannabis, and we are happy to have joining us today Mr. Marcus Ramkissoon from all the way in Trinidad. And Marcus is one of the experts in the region on cannabis and marijuana and the development of the cannabis trade. Marcus, tell us a little about yourself so that the audience can be familiar with who Marcus is.
All right. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, guys, and blessed afternoon or evening to all your listeners and everyone viewing. I'm Marcus Ramkissoon. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, yes, a true Caribbean citizen, if you will. And I have specialized in cannabis sciences, cannabis business, and cannabis policy. Today, I am one of the most educated cannabis advisors within the international industry. Aside from my bachelor's degree in life sciences, I currently hold over 76 qualifications. Most of those are continuing medical education, coursework, and certifications from Cannabis Sciences. I also hold a Post Baccalaureate Certificate in Regulatory Affairs for Cannabis Control and a Master of Science degree in Cannabis Science and Commerce. I'm just about to start my PhD for Governance and Public Policy, actually, on cannabis policy. So I remain, I believe, one of the most educated cannabis policy advisors, especially within the region, definitely, and within the international industry. So I've assisted governments throughout the region, officially and unofficially, with the preparation of their primary and subsidiary legislative frameworks regarding cannabis, medicinal cannabis, sometimes cannabis for religious purposes, and so forth. And I'm proud to say that now my proposed regulatory framework is being used in, I believe, every island within the region, from Belize all the way down to Trinidad. So there's always a right way and a wrong way to approach everything. And what I hope to achieve by my work within the region especially is to have our country set about the right cannabis code, right cannabis policy legislative framework towards having a properly functioning feasible industry going forward.
Marcus, give us a quick synopsis, if you can, on where we are today. A snapshot. The cannabis trade globally, but more specific in the Caribbean. Where are we now, and where are we heading to?
We're still at the very beginning stages of an industry. In as much as the regulated industry restarted, and I say restarted because it was actually completely legal, especially in the region, up to 1885. And from that point, we started seeing various laws into play for restrictions, lifting restrictions, for tobacco restrictions, a number of things. So within our modern time now, present times, you can say, we've seen the industry, a resurgence in the industry, starting with California back in 1996 with the medicinal cannabis industry. And that has been the beginning of our progression, I would say, within the industry so far. In the region, a lot of activists, especially, like to say that we're very far behind, and the world has started so long ago, and it's relative because yes, those at the earlier stages than us, meaning those that have been around this industry for the last 20 years, that is no short space of time, has been able to make the most advantage or have the most advantage financially in this industry. In that when countries and jurisdictions just start their regulative processes, you find that there's a lot of loopholes and lacunae, and those around and those smart enough to take advantage of it at that time will and did and have been quite successful. Just like with nowadays you see crypto technology, cryptocurrency and stuff like Bitcoin. If you were wise enough to buy Bitcoin when it was $100 for one, you would have taken advantage of the early stages of that industry, correct? So it's almost the same now, whereas now you would see that there's a lot less finances to make as an individual entrepreneur within the industry. One, because of the increased competition, that being laws being approved in various jurisdictions and countries allowing for industry. Two, better regulated processes, so less lacunae, less loopholes to take advantage of. And we're still moving forward in that there are a lot of countries now. Let's look within the region and look at Jamaica, let's say. Jamaica has started conducting commercial exports in 2020 or so. And it has now, I think, conducted exports to 10 countries. But I have to raise the question whether or not that's approved by the international body. To my knowledge and information, so long as your country goes against international treaty guidelines, such as allowing religious trade for cannabis, you can have problems with the exportation and importation due to international routes. And maybe just because we're now coming out of a pandemic that kept the world busy for a couple of years, if you want to put it that way, maybe no one just hasn't taken notice yet of the small businesses that's happening. So, there's a lot of implication. Within my research for my PhD, I'm actually going to try to get further into that point to ascertain from the international body where their heads are at now. I can guarantee that just 3 years ago, St. Vincent put forward 3 primary legislative frameworks towards the International Narcotics Control Board, that body that is responsible for the enforcement of the International Drugs Treaty. And they asked if everything was fine, and the INC responded to them and said, well, look, your medical industry, cannabis industry bill is fine, your traditional farmers bill is fine. But if you go forward with your proposed sacramental bill, you will have problems with the industry in terms of export and import. We will issue a first warning of non-compliance to the international treaty, and that will be enough to prevent you from exporting cannabis under the cannabis legislation. You have to go about it through a different method under your Ministry of Health and so forth. And St. Vincent at the time, and this came directly from Minister Sabuto, who's a good friend of mine. He said that because of that, they pulled their sacramental bill. They didn't even take it to Parliament because their country, of course, is interested in moving that industry forward due to the culture of the island there. So there remains some preclusions within the actual international framework that a lot of countries, not just within the region, and mind you, around the world, have not taken enough consideration of, and that can lead to problems within the industry. Let's take it out of the region and look at Canada. Canada has allowed for non-medical adult use, which is commonly termed recreational. And due to that, they have been given the first warning of non-compliance by the INC. And as far as I'm aware, and have confirmed with a number of large exporters in Canada, none of those exports of cannabis are done under cannabis legislation and cannabis licenses. They have to apply for narcotics handling, which all pharmacies and pharmacists have, and narcotics export licenses, specifically under different legislation, to be able to enact the import or export of cannabis into their jurisdiction. So if it's happening with Canada as a big country, I'm sure we in our islands within the region will face the same problem. I can't see it being an exception for us, whereby it's happening for them. So there's a lot of aspects to take consideration of when legislating this cannabis industry. And if not looked at from the very start, the jurisdictions that have placed those laws can have problems. And as I just said, just to roll it into one, the individuals who may have taken advantage of lacunae and loopholes within first or initial implementation of law, whereby some of that law is not the absolute right way of doing things, they would of course make a lot of money, right? Just like you would have seen in California, in Europe, and these places earlier on. Now the industry is quite cheap. If you listen now, persons within some of those jurisdictions in the United States, like California, will tell you that it's not worth doing business there anymore in cannabis. right, due to the new regulations and how it's set about new taxes and stuff, especially across there, is ridiculous in some instances. So I don't think we are late. I think we are on the cusp of getting it right. And I hope that jurisdictions, especially within our region, adhere to doing the right thing and are able to get their frameworks correct from the onset. I mean, I've helped a number of countries. Does not mean that those countries have done the right thing. I am just the advisor. The government will choose what it wants to choose out of my advice. And having with my experience so far, I can tell you that even the governments that choose to do with everything I've said, I won't say which ones are so. I mean, one of them has everything in writing, primary and subsidiary legislation, yet it wasn't called back to return to advise the newly established commission or licensing authority. And, 3-4 years later, no licenses are granted because they don't know how to implement it. And it's pretty straightforward, but you do have to have an understanding of what you're doing. Here in Trinidad and Tobago, where we've just passed our medical framework, I've also been the advisor for the government here, and a lot of things, I now have to go on the media and complain and say that, this is wrong and this is going to cause this and this is, and, we're still in that process. So, and hopefully I would apply to the board in Trinidad and Tobago. I do have the qualifications for the position, of course, and be able to help with the regulations here. Because, again, there are, here in Trinidad, we've allowed for religious exports and imports of cannabis. I can tell you there's no controlled substance in the world that's allowed for import or export for religious purposes. None, not a single one. So that aspect of it is nonsense, if you want to call it that, and can put our country in trouble in terms of correspondent banking, because now we're breaking with international treaties, and even then with export and import, again, breaking international treaties. And as the developing country who sometimes depends on the international body, the IMF, for loans, we're supposed to be in compliance with international treaties and law if we are to get loans. Those things can affect us even further when we get to that part of the story. So it's something that I hope governments in the region do start thinking about a little more seriously in terms of the consequences of bad legislation for this country.
So Marcus, thank you for that excellent description that you've given so far. I'll make a disclosure. I sit on the Cannabis Commission in Dominica, the recently constituted Cannabis Commission, which you have been invited to advise, and that commission sits under the stewardship of the Attorney General. You've made an interesting mention with regards to import and export under religious terms. And this is something that often falls within the ambit of these groups feeling that as the historically marginalized groups who were involved in cannabis, then illegally, that they should be given basically the right to exploit the good times. How do you get through to these communities, the Rastafarian communities throughout, for example, throughout the Caribbean? Each of the islands have strong Rastafarian communities for whom the cannabis is a form of sacrament, so to speak. How do you get that across and balance that with the need for all of our jurisdictions to have an enabling environment for the entire industry that they too will benefit from? How do you get that across?
But more conversations are necessary, right? More conversations with better explanation is necessary. As you can see, I have dreadlocks. I'm not Rastafari by religion or faith, but I do uphold the general principles of individuality, unity, and love. So I do have an understanding of where they come from. However, I have had to explain to these groups in the different islands the risks and benefits, if you will. And yes, you're absolutely correct. Most of these groups have demanded, for lack of a better word, that they be at the forefront of the industry, which is perfectly reasonable. However, what I found happening was that I would hear, we want to be at the forefront of the business side of the industry. industry. We want to generate a lot of revenue within this industry as they should. But at the same time, we want it legal and we want everybody to have it, we want everybody to grow it. It must be like tomatoes in your yard, right? And there's a lot to take in there because first of all, tomatoes in your yard is a very weird thing. We live in a developing world where we don't uphold certain international principles and laws, such as those of plant rights and intellectual property regarding plants. Did you know that if you want to plant a tomato in your yard, right, you're supposed to it's supposed to go to the plant shop, agriculture place, wherever, and either buy a tomato plant or buy a pot of seeds, right? And if you plant it, you could eat the tomatoes, you could sell the tomatoes, you could do what you want. But you are not supposed to dry that tomato, take out the seeds, and sell it at any point in time, right? Which is a common practice within the region, right? The reason for this is because, as you might know, there are hundreds of varieties of tomatoes, beefeater, pear-shaped, cherry tomatoes, all these things. This don't come about by chance, See, people are into the business of agriculture that spend years actually selectively breeding a strain of tomatoes for you to get this nice sweet cherry tomato on your table, for you to get this nice big meaty one that you could put in a burger or something and all these things. And people is not taking their time and their effort for nothing, right? What they're doing it for is to own the rights and the intellectual property on that genetic that they've now created, right? That they've now selectively bred. And when you do that, you end up owning the genetic code for a few years, a number of years, well, so that any royalties or revenues coming back from that particular genetic are supposed to come back to you. That's like with copyright laws and in terms of literary works and music and stuff, just to relate it to more people listening. It's the same thing with plants. So when you're regulating a plant, you have to be able to understand that plants contain intellectual property rights also, depending on the breeder. But in the cannabis industry, that's even more so, as all the thousands of different names that you hear all the time usually are individual selectively bred strains or genetics that each has a different cannabinoid and terpene profile, and in most cases each belongs to different owners. And within the world now for the last few years, they have been regulating cannabis genetics. So I've been warning governments even in the region who are trying to say, well, we'll find something special on our island that's different from the rest of the world, to be careful, because we are in a part of the world that cannabis is not endemic from, right? They didn't develop here. And a lot of the genetics, due to the wide eradication programs in the 80s and 90s, the 90s especially, a lot of the genetics that you find in the islands now are recent genetics from places like Europe and the US. And when one of these countries come out and say, okay, look, we've gotten this country-specific strain here and this is ours. And next thing they do the genetic testing and then realize, well, 70% of it is an American, 30% of it in Europe is European, and nothing of it has anything to do with the Caribbean. Those countries might be embarrassed. So all of this needs to be considered. And I mentioned just now that, when regulating a plant, well, here's the thing about cannabis, right? It is a plant, sure. And as we just said, plants have certain things to consider, like intellectual property rights. But it's not just a plant, is it? It's also a consumable product, meaning something that you're going to ingest or put into your body in different ways, right? What do we know about consumable products? From caviar to water, they all have heavy regulations because it's a product that you're producing for someone to put into their bodies, right? And so this is the reason we can't just go pull water by a spring and sell them, right? You have to meet certain regulatory standards. There's no product in the world that is not regulated.
Marcus,
right? And that's something you need people to understand.
Yeah, let me interrupt you for a quick second, because we're getting down to the grassroots, youth and man and woman on the street. You've got these island governments, they're all different. So we're not talking about one. Unfortunately, you can even opine on that. Should we have just one standard legislation for the region, or should every country have its different rules, or how closely should they mirror each other? But where does a country like Dominica go from here? What's to prevent the government of Dominica from granting Marcus a license or Jane a license to open a cannabis bar or someplace dispensary or a place where people can come and consume, a tourist can come and consume marijuana and make that part of the tourist trade or whatever. What's to prevent that? Because I think people want to stop the talk right now. They're frustrated and they want to see something, they want to feel something. How can we
before Marcus answers you, I want to just inject that the scope of the Cannabis Commission here is to create the regulatory and legal framework for the beginnings of the industry. So, right. Marcus, please answer.
Well, okay, so it comes down to the same answer, which is yes, you have to. There's a path to take, unfortunately, and that path does take some time. The sooner the decision was made, the sooner things happen, then better. But look, even in Trinidad, we just passed our law, which was put to the Parliament at the end of 2019. Now we're in middle 2022. Right? It went through a 2-year joint-led committee. So it all relies on your Parliament, and your government. If after the bill is finished, it goes to Parliament, and your opposition, I don't know the politics of Dominica at this point, I apologize, but maybe your opposition says, we don't trust that. Right? One more information. And they send it to a joint select committee that could take 1 year it could take months or it could take years. You all know how JSC works, right? It could take any point in time. And then even if the bill is passed in the House and Senate and approved by President or so forth and is ready, you still have to establish a commission, to which our government said it would take about 6 months. It actually took a little longer than that. And
well, we've established that now, and Kenny sits on the commission. So Kenny, how can we get going? I mean, I hate to seem so, impatient.
So what you will have now is the government appointed technical commission, right? A committee to decide. That's not a commission. We're talking about when the law is established.
Correct.
And the law establishes the licensing authority.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Or the licensing authority to go forward. So that board can take you 6 months to establish. Hopefully, it can take you a year like some of the other countries in the region. It can take you 2 years like some of the US jurisdictions. So don't think it's because we in the Caribbean we take in long. No. Some places in the US and Europe took a lot longer after they passed their. So honestly, gentlemen, and for your viewers, unfortunately, it's not a today tomorrow situation in the least, right? It can take easily a year or two before your industry is up and running to the point where you can apply for a license. You're talking about buying stuff in a store yet. Talking about applying for a license to go forward. So you have to be patient, and hopefully your government will work faster. Hopefully the technical committee set up will be able to establish their decision quicker than hopefully through your Attorney General's report back to Cabinet. They might be able to start working on the primary legislation. And the faster things happen, the faster it will still take a minimum of a year to 2 before you're ready to apply for a license in your country.
Okay, so the other thing to follow on from that is there in your mind a best of breed legislation within the region? And Sam mentioned earlier whether there would be any value of harmonizing the legislation. In the Eastern Caribbean, we have the OECS, the Organization of East Caribbean States, and our cryptocurrency legislation, for example, is harmonized. So each of the different jurisdictions have cryptocurrency legislation. Some are tardier than the others in passing it, but it is essentially the same. Our IBC, our International Business Company regulations, which was passed a year and a half ago under pressure from the OECD, again is also harmonized. And so tell me what you think about the possibility of harmonizing legislation, or that failing that, what's the best of breed legislation within the region that we can work with?
Okay, so definitely harmonization of legislation is absolutely necessary, not just within the region, but I would say internationally. We should, I liken it to something that our government said some time ago, which is that some countries are putting legislation towards cannabis, and we're developing countries, so maybe we should look at not regulating it as much. Not over-regulation we're talking about at all. And my question had to be, are we different? Do you want to know that when you go to a foreign country, you get in food or drink that is of a better quality, not taste we're talking about, of a better quality to put into your body than when you come home? Why should we have anything less in terms of consumable products, in terms of quality, in any level? So harmonization for me is absolutely necessary, absolutely important, and it is necessary for the governments within the region to look at the right principles when putting forward their legislation, because as I said earlier, there's a lot of room for mistakes and a lot of room for lacunae. We started off the discussion with talking about the international body and export and import. If any country regulates their cannabis industry out of compliance with the international guidelines that country has already signed on to, then they're breaking with international law. And international law does have priority at different levels over domestic laws. It's the reason why we have laws, right? But we in a country have laws to govern ourselves within the country. And we as countries sign on to international law so that there's a governing body over countries, right? And part of this international community and international society. Yes, there should be some communication between the governments to have this harmonization. But I'll tell you what happened there, literally. In 2014, I visited Jamaica, and then I had been working a year and change on a proposed regulatory framework for cannabis. Back then, that framework was 80 pages long and did not contain the export and import regulations nor the tracking and monitoring regulations purposely. I went to Jamaica and I met with someone there, won't say who, and I gave that person the hard copy of the regulations. I spent a year in Jamaica, witnessed the planting of the first tree at the UV and all that stuff when all the government ministers was fighting for the shovel to plant this one cannabis tree, an amazing moment. And it took me 8 months before I was able to meet a government member, and I was able to meet the then General Secretary, Mr. Paul Burke, and gave him this hard copy of my proposed regulation. And he flipped through it, looked at it, sat quietly and said, "Well, Mr. Ramkissoon, we have this already, we're using it." I said, "Well, is my name on it?" I said, "No." That was the end of that conversation. And true to the fact is that that original proposed framework forms and continue to form a part of the Jamaican medical cannabis regulations. It had nothing to do with the religious aspect. It was all medicinal at that time for me. And that's also why, as I can prove, Jamaica didn't institute their tracking and monitoring regulations until 3 years later, at the end of 2018. Didn't actually put it into place properly until 2020. And they're still working on the export and import regulations.
So okay. Shifting gears a little, going into export and import, because...
No, wait. Before you shift those gears, let me finish telling you this story, because I think I want you all, and for your topic and what you're asking, and your viewers to understand what happened. After Jamaica, I continued working on my proposed regulation, and was hired by the government of Antigua in 2018 to write their primary and subsidiary framework. Primary framework is your bill, which will turn into an act of law, and your subsidiary framework is your regulations that follow. Regulations can be a page long, or it can be 1,000 pages long, such as in customs regulations and so on. It depends on the content of the material and the topic, right? Our framework in Antigua, the primary is like everyone else, it's about 60 clauses, and the secondary was 300 pages long and 225 clauses, right? Whilst we were doing it in Antigua, St. Vincent was also doing theirs. And I was supposed to advise their government, but they ended up appointing a physician who has Caribbean roots and practices in Canada, claims to be an expert, but at the same time is proud to tell the world on video hemp is the male form of cannabis, which is absolutely not. Okay, so I don't know if someone who doesn't know what cannabis is can call himself an expert, but he was appointed to do their primary and subsidiary. What happened was they took their primary from the Antigua primary, but they did not have the access to the subsidiary legislation from Antigua at the time, which would explain and expand on all the points in the primary. So because they weren't able to understand the primary legislation of Antigua properly, non-prescribable versus prescribable medicinal cannabis, prescription versus recommendation, pharmacy versus dispensary, which represents my unique concept and work in the industry, they made a little bit of a mess of things. And they allowed for prescription and medical certificate being the recommendation, and dispensation only by a pharmacy, which leads to all sorts of issues, because you can't have cannabis flower being sold in a dispensary, in a pharmacy where children are allowed to enter. It's against moral principles and ethics and all that. You might as well send a child in direction, basically. And because of that lack of understanding, Barbados then went and took their primary legislation from the Antigua and the St. Vincent primary, and Trinidad ended up using the Barbados primary mainly into our legislation here. So, and none of those last three countries had the benefit of the subsidiary legislation from Antigua, the regulation, which explained everything. And therefore, there exist a lot of disputes in the laws of these three countries, right? Unfortunately, including Trinidad and Tobago, my own country. Had they had the benefit of the regulations, you would have found a lot more consistency between the laws and harmony, as you said, between the laws of those countries so far. So that's where the mistakes happen. There's always a point in time where the first mistake starts, and then it goes like message received, right? And mistakes just get worse. So there's ways of doing things the right way, and there's ways of doing things not the right way. And unfortunately, more countries now within our our curriculum has the wrong way as opposed to the right. So I'm hoping that as we go forward, these other countries, your own Dominica, St. Lucia, all these other islands that are coming on board now, would start listening, hopefully get in touch with someone like myself or someone who knows, and be able to get better advice going forward. Because if we adopt, which is commonplace within the Caribbean, adopt quickly the regulatory framework of the most recent island or another island, we may adopt the wrong thing.
Yeah.
So
going back to my point, I was following the money. I had a recent conversation with Congressman Palmetta, who represents and has represented for a long time Denver, the area around Denver, and he's been. They've been on the front of the line with cannabis legislation, and he spoke to me about the challenge that they have and challenges they have with the money. You're developing an industry that's basically not bankable, and right now there's some work on changing that in the United States at the federal level, but because of partisan politics in the U.S., there's not a likelihood that this will be resolved anytime soon. Speak about the money and speak to the challenges with the bankability of any proceeds from cannabis, and where do you see us going from now, and give us an idea of the time frame within which this will be resolved.
There's in every career, in every type of career, there's always people who are better at their job and people who aren't. Your lawyer, your physician, anything, right? And it usually comes down to knowledge and experience, of course. I have heard this term used a lot within our industry, that cannabis and the cannabis industry is not bankable. So let me put some clarification on it, right? Let me make a point first, which is cannabis is regulated according to the international treaties. The international treaties are supposed to guide our domestic drug laws, right? We build our drug laws based on the guidelines of those treaties. And within those treaties, cannabis is regulated exactly the same as opium. When you get to the section on cannabis, it tells you literally, go back to the section on opium. and you follow those rules. Opium is produced a number of ways, synthetically mostly. But a number of countries and jurisdictions have laws for the cultivation of opium for medical purposes, Australia being the most recent country to allow such. How is it that those guys who cultivated opium, right, way more strict a substance than cannabis in most people's understanding? How is it that these farmers are banking their money? They are, I can guarantee you that. But let me tell you how. Those jurisdictions that federally, right, remember the US is a country, United States of America, that is composed of states. And therefore state law is different from federal law. When you want to look at the country's law in the US, you have to look at the federal law, not the individual states law. Right? Just like when you're looking at the law of any of our regional countries like Dominica, you don't look at a parish, right, which does not, in our case, have different laws from our central government, right? But that's just how it is. So if a country regulates the cannabis industry properly according to the international guidelines, they are able to bank. That's simply the case, gentlemen. And out of now a large number of US federally regulated banks in the US, 750 something of them, 55 or 57, I think, 757, do conduct cannabis business transactions. The reason for that is they conduct these business transactions with those companies that have the regulations within their jurisdiction that meet the international law and is compliant with the international law. So therefore, all we have to do in our country, gentlemen, is regulate the cannabis industry in full accordance with the international principle, and we will be able to engage in US correspondent banking. Simple.
There is one caveat to that. What you mentioned a while ago, which is extremely true, that there's 750 odd financial institutions, and I like to say financial institutions because many of them are credit unions.
Yes, you're right. They're not all banks. They are financial institutions. But a large number of them are fully accredited, fully regulated, federal US banks.
But when you come into the Caribbean, and we're talking within the context of Dominica and the Eastern Caribbean, Dominica, for example, our main bank only has one correspondent bank. So you're not looking at, the United States has a diversity of financial institutions. So you are correct in that if we meet what we call the compliance standards through regulation, then we will be able to better approach the risk factor of banking cannabis proceeds. But we have to also look at the other part, which is the risk profile or the appetite for risk of our local banks within the context that they have one correspondent bank. And so therefore it puts...
Wait, hold on, gentlemen. You're saying one correspondent bank. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about when money has to move from Trinidad to Tobago, one country.
Yes.
Right? Money has to go to the US and come back down here.
Yes.
Our banking works in the region, in every single country.
True.
Right? So all the banks within Dominica have to engage in US correspondent banking.
Correct.
Right?
Yes.
We're talking about a correspondent bank. We're talking about a practice within banking itself.
Correct. Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That is the risk factor for them, because if they do or conduct transactions of business with a licensed medicinal cannabis business that is following a law within a jurisdiction that is out of compliance with the international law, then that bank risks losing its US correspondent banking status, and that represents anywhere between 25 to 50 to more percentage of their business. And that is why the banks will not engage in banking for the industry, whether domestic or international, right? Because this is going to cause a problem. Now, if you're local, meaning that you have no reason to send or receive monies from abroad with your cannabis business, you're fine, You're fine if you're dealing strictly with domestic industry and you just have to bank your money and withdraw and pay your bills and utilities and stuff, you're good to go.
But Marcus, let me correct you there if I may.
Yeah.
If a domestic bank becomes aware that you are engaging in the cannabis trade, they will shut down your account. I'm just letting you know that's what's going to happen.
They still risk losing their U.S. currency.
It's still, there's a nexus there.
And in the past, for example, I'll give a reference. St. Kitts had in the past three correspondent banks. They had Wells Fargo, they had Citibank, and they had Bank of America. Now they're down to one. Now, in the past, when you have more banks, one of the banks might have a larger appetite for the risk on the basis that this is a burgeoning industry. What tends to happen?
What you find is that government local banks are the ones that are willing to take the risk for the domestic banking at some level.
Yes,
right?
at some level.
Countries have big inclusions. Other countries have allowed. The US has allowed for subsidiary industries to collect the money and then do the banking. So you go in the US to a company that is registered to nothing to do with cannabis, and they take your money, and I don't know what's the word to use for it, because it's so weird that it's happening in these developed countries that are supposed to follow laws. We moved from carrying bags of cash in the industry to the IRS in the US to now going to a subsidiary company that would collect the money and manage it, if you will, and then take that into the IRS, the taxes and all that stuff. So again, yes, it's still heavily under-regulated in terms of what it's supposed to be. And it all comes down to meeting with that international compliance, because
Correct.
The US has no federal, it's illegal federally, right? And this is why if you have an account in the US and you engage in banking in the legitimate cannabis business in Dominica, let's say, your US account can be frozen.
Yes. So
right.
Following,
a lot of implications there.
I want to follow on from that. Well, I want to kind of segue to something Sam brought up earlier, which is where he was stating that he didn't want to seem gung-ho, but because of his conversations with the young entrepreneurs, he wanted to kind of understand what is the clear path to them being able to legally produce and legally be compensated for the production of cannabis products locally. What is the path, if you could give the steps?
Right, so it comes back down to some of the stuff we were discussing earlier. It all comes now full circle, right? Your government has to be able to follow the international guidelines and principles when it comes to legislating and regulating the industry. That's the first step. It's actually the main reason I get my job, right? When I approach governments and I apply and I have my interview, one of the first things I say to them is, okay, so we're going to establish an industry for you that will bring revenue and all that good stuff, but it's also going to be internationally compliant with the International Drug Treaty Center. That's one of the biggest things that, the biggest aspects that gets me my job, because it's something that a lot of consultants don't understand. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a legal representative, but I do have a very good grasp and understanding of the international treaties and international law, and that plays a major role in my job of advising the way forward in regulation. Medicinal is the way to go. We cannot look at non-medicinal adult use regulated yet. Brings us back to the religious aspect, right? Because we were discussing earlier, I didn't get to finish the point on what about how do we handle the Rastafari groups, maybe other religious groups that for lack of a better word, demanding, rightfully so, that they be a major part of this industry going forward. The problem in Jamaica and Antigua was that these religious groups insisted on having religious trade at some level. Jamaica insisted on it with the expectation that they would make a lot of money from it. And they went ahead and they put non-profit laws, just like you would see in all the other jurisdictions, for you to engage in cannabis business under religious purposes or for religious purposes, without the ability to make profits or to engage in the non-profit organizational acts and so forth. And they still went ahead, and you see the problems in Jamaica. You hear the problems over the years of the small man can't enter the industry and all that. The next biggest aspect in the regulations in that topic is social equity, meaning how do we protect local stakeholders. Jamaica went ahead and said, okay, 51% of the business must belong to Jamaica. That was a big problem. First of all, they deterred heavy international investments, right? Because who wants to invest millions of dollars in a business and then give full ownership, 51%, to someone, right? That's not, nobody wants to do that, right? So Barbados and Trinidad went with the 30% and said, we're smarter. But here's the thing, gentlemen, within that rule, do you think any company that's coming to spend $1 million US or more, which is a general price or average price to get into this industry, and they're coming to say, okay, let's just pick up a poor man off the street of these islands and give him 30% of our business? No. They're going to the wealthy individuals that can put 30% of the finances into the business. So that law does not help the poor man, the small man, in any way whatsoever. It helps the rich to become richer, right? And it's not something that works for social equity. There are much better social equity programs that can be applied that we won't discuss today, but it's something that is easy to put into work. Right. In Antigua, the Rastafari groups wanted to engage in trade, although not for profit, but was still given one each of the medicinal licenses by the government of Antigua. The Prime Minister there, having grown up part of his life with the Rastafari groups, has a lot of respect for them, has issued one of those licenses each free in terms of like reparations, if you will. And that can be used by that group to engage in business profitably. What should have been done is the religious aspects can be taken care of by decriminalization, which is allowed by the international framework, because another aspect of the international framework is that jurisdictions are supposed to do all in their power to reduce the illicit market, right? So it's not just about, okay, we're using it for medicinal and scientific, we also have the obligation to reduce the illicit market, and decriminalization does that, right? Very much so, actually. Within decriminalization, you can use cannabis for any reason, religious included. If you're allowed to cultivate at home, which should be done under license, because international treaties allow for or mandate that every production of cannabis has to be under license. You can simply, the way we in Trinidad go and see CJ Tours, I don't know what it's like in Dominica, but we have to apply for a permit, like $10 TT, $3 EC or something, to go see turtles on the beach. So you apply for that type of permit, something cheap, but something that would allow us to meet the international compliance works, right? And then allow persons to cultivate X amount at home for their personal reason, whatever it is. And that can easily take care of the biggest aspect of the religion. Wow. What does the religious groups ask for? 3 things. We want to grow it and use it at home for religious purposes. We want to grow it and use it at the place of worship, because that's where we use it for religious purposes also. So, and we want to make money off of it. So, the growing it and using it at the place of worship could have been taken care of and can be taken care of, like in Dominica, as an order to the Dangerous Drugs Act. I don't know what the corresponding misuse of drugs or whatever it's named there. An order which can be like a paragraph paper that international bodies never get to look at, that simply states that a registered place of worship may apply not to the Cannabis Licensing Authority, that's what we did in Antigua, but to the Attorney General's office or anybody that the government assumed, for a permit again for their registered place of worship to be able to allow to grow X amount of plants, standardized and everything. And they can meet certain regulations if they have to or not, depending on the amount of plants that they grow. Right? If it's more than a certain amount, they can meet the tracking regulations that we need for the medical industry or something of the sort. Right? But don't put it into Cannabis Legislation Act or the regulation, because that is what is going to cause us to miss with the international treaties, right?
Okay, Marcus, sorry. No, you go ahead. I want to ask you something. Go ahead, I want to ask you something afterwards. I didn't mean to cut you off.
So just to come back to your question, the main point of your question, we need to go forward with the medicinal cannabis industry. You need to regulate supply as much as you need to regulate access. Regulating supply is easy if you will. You know, there's cultivation, there's extraction. A lot of the countries made mistakes, not Antigua, in terms of putting the extraction as one license, meaning processing as a license, and people who want to make like edibles and stuff have to go through that license. That needs to be separated, like Antigua, into extraction and processing and infused product manufacture. Why? Because you would find that people in the industry might find one person wanting to make brownies while another one wants to make gummies, while a larger company wants to make 10 different products. So you put that infused products license separately, put it into different tiers, right? And that is what is going to encourage the local production of unique products that may have availability for an export market. We follow the international treaty guidelines on the medical, how you regulate the cultivation, how you regulate processing and all that stuff. And then when it comes to dispensation, it's a medicine. So, and it's a medicine that can be intoxicating, right? So, first of all, you have to look at your access, your physician access, your medical practitioner being able to prescribe and recommend. And what a lot of countries didn't realize that Antigua did is that you cannot prescribe a plant. Well, you cannot prescribe the cannabis plant. Why? The top of a single plant will contain a different level or percentage of cannabinoids from the bottom of the same plant. That's how simply how it works. You might find 10% THC in the top buds and 2% THC in the bottom buds, right? Thereby not allowing for the elucidation of a standardized exact dose, which is necessary for the writing of a traditional prescription. What do you do then? You apply a format of a medicinal regulation, a medical recommendation, where the medical practitioner can recommend those products. And then if you have to do that, then you have to look at a separation of the classification of medicines, which I proposed to Antigua. They've accepted into prescribable and non-prescribable medicinal cannabis. All medicinal cannabis, then you have prescribable, like those oils and tinctures and stuff you see on the shelf that you can get an exact dose from, and those non-prescribable, like cannabis flower, certain extracts, maybe the intoxicating intoxicating edibles that you do want in a pharmacy. And then dispensation, you dispense the prescribable from a pharmacy and you dispense the non-prescribable from a medicinal cannabis dispensary, which is guided by the same laws of a pharmacy, in fact exceeding such, and which will also contain the consumption lounge, right? Countries like Barbuda didn't understand the consumption lounge at first. They put it within their law and then said, we're not allowing smoking or vaporization in there. And I had to ask, well, what do you have a consumption lounge for? They said, well, it's to take pills and, use creams and stuff. And you could do that on a bus. You could do that walking down the street. The reason for consumption lounge is they're now making a product into a medicine that may not be compliant for use in every situation, such as if you live in a tenanted building and your landlord's agreement states that you cannot possess dangerous drugs on compound, whether it's a medicine or not, it's still classed as a dangerous drug, right? Better yet, most of those agreements state you cannot vaporize or smoke anything on the compound, right? So what are you saying? Are we telling people, okay, here's a medicine, you can't use it, let's go a step further. What about those people who live right next door to a school? Forget your 500 meters and 300 and whatever the law is, who live right next door to a school. Are we telling them you can't use your medicine at home now that it's medicine? We are. Because they don't want somebody smoking or vaporizing next to a school in the early morning hours, right? And children being able to smell and inhale something that could potentially intoxicate them, right? So you have to put laws in place for that. What we've done in Antigua is during the hours of operation of a school or daycare or university or whatever it is, a person is not allowed, who lives within a certain distance, is not allowed to use at their homes. And this is why you have to have a consumption lounge. So that those persons, now have a legislated space that they can medicate and consume their medication, right? So all these things have to be taken into consideration properly. This is what myself as an advisor, this is what I do. The just part, as I just said, needs to be separate completely, deal with it on a proper medicinal level, and then you will be able to bank, you will be able to engage in US correspondent banking, and you'll have a proper industry.
Okay, Marcus, we've been dancing around this issue, and I will try to be as straightforward as possible. We have young people or people that are not so young in Dominica and in the Caribbean who have gone to jail for this marijuana, who have been, they would say, in the trenches, suffering, struggling. And they are frustrated, and they hear all of these talks about regulations, and for them, that doesn't mean anything. So I want to be the advocate because they're not here to speak this evening. I do realize that things aren't that simple. But let's try to simplify and create the lowest hanging fruit possible that can allow the common man or common woman to get into the cannabis business. How do you suggest that they go forward? Because they feel that this is just a bunch of talk. They are also very much afraid that when money starts to flow in, that it will flow past them, because the big boys and big girls, they be like Kenny and myself, even though I don't have an interest in getting it. I don't think Kenny has an interest at all. But they're afraid that the people who are better positioned will, of course, be the ones to get the benefits from this. How can we help these people, and how can we help the government to set up a system where people can get on board and make money legally from what they've been attempting to do illegally for decades?
Well, I think it all comes down to the right regulatory framework. But there's a reality in the industry, and there's also a lot of dreams in the industry. A lot of people see that it's an upcoming industry that's been touted to, be worth the billions, right? Mm-hmm. And they believe that it's a high revenue industry, which it is, and that establishing a framework within a country would automatically bring a lot of revenue to a lot of people. That's simply not the case. I was saying earlier that when regulating cannabis, you have to look at it in terms of what it is. And what it is not just a single product category. It's a plant, it's a consumable substance, it's a medicine, and it's a narcotic, right? A scheduled narcotic. That means that when you're regulating the substance, you have to regulate it according to all those product categories. You can't just pick and choose and say, let's regulate it as a plant or let's regulate it as a food. But let's take it down to the simpler terms, as you see here. Let's look at the simplest consumable product, water. Use this example all the time. What happened with water? Right? We used to drink water from glass in the tap, and now the bottled water industry has become one of the biggest industries in the world. Those that are into the industry making a lot of money. But I don't see, here even in my country, and I assume Dominica has more, I don't see people filling water by spraying and selling and making money. And I have to draw this analogy because it does come back directly to cannabis. People expect that when the industry is regulated, they will be able to grow this plant in their yard and sell it to someone who is interested in selling it downstream, and they can make money. Let's look at alcohol. You can't do that with alcohol. I don't know what laws in Dominica, but you cannot. We allow, the only thing we can produce at home is wine, up to 12 bottles, and you can't sell it. That's for home use. And in fact, there's a number of loopholes in our alcohol law, which I'm sure takes place also in Dominica, that no one's questioned. Do you guys have punch liquor? Punch liquor?
Yes.
That's allowing someone without a liquor license to produce, not just sell, produce an alcohol, right? Even if they're taking the alcohol that's already produced, they are combining with ingredients, the consumable product going into your body, with alcohol and selling it legally. That's a big loophole. And people may look at those things in our region and say, but look, we could sell punch liquor.
Yeah.
Go, just because there's a issue, and it is an issue, right? A lot of people get sick with punch liquor. I don't know what the Dominica or it's smaller, but there, you don't know who clean kitchen or who not so clean kitchen making punch liquor. That is why you have an industry that regulates the food industry in every country, and food badges and inspection of kitchens and approvals and all these things. Because you don't want to know that you're taking your kids out to eat and tomorrow you're going to get sick. Right? That's something that we try to prevent. And that is the same for every consumable product. So go back to the water. Heavy regulation on water. Right? Where you get it from, how you filter it, how you package it, what cleanliness methods and sanitization methods you need within your factory, people within your facility, how they must be attired and so forth with headgear and body gear and all these things. Why? Because it's a consumable product. So I want people to understand that there's no product in the world that will not fall to corporate success. more money will always. Even tomatoes, any fruit, any vegetable, think about it reasonably, right? Anything like this, it's the same problem. This is how society works in our capitalist society. If you have the money to invest into something and to make something, you're going to make more money. Let's talk about the actual industry. If the licenses were free, gentlemen, free, forget the cost of the license. What about the cost to actually meet these regulations now for this consumable product to get into the industry? What about the cost to meet as a scheduled narcotic, right? Medicine, right? The regulations regarding those to get into the industry. This is why we see that a cultivation, as simple as a cultivation in the cannabis industry, any country in the world, Jamaica, even in the region, Barbados, everywhere in the region, you have to have certain security implementations that you have that are higher than if you're growing papaya or any type of farm, and this is because it's a high cash industry, it's a narcotic. You don't want someone stealing that and putting it in the illicit market that children can get. If somebody come and steal your papayas in the night, you might find it on the road selling the next morning or in a market, but if somebody buy it and eat it, they're going to die, right? I ain't saying cannabis, let me rephrase that. It's not going to intoxicate you or put you in any risk, right? Whereas this being an intoxicating product can, right? And it can be accessed by children in the illicit market, and therefore it needs to be regulated properly.
Pardon me.
Hold on, what it costs? So if you want to get into a half acre, 20,000 square feet of cultivation, we discuss the actual cost. In a cultivation space, if you own the land completely, so you don't have to pay no lease, no rent, no nothing, forgetting all that, right? Bypassing that. You still have to fence the entire place, right? Outdoor cultivation we're talking about there. You have to do security fencing so that nobody can jump over. You have cameras every 10 or 15 feet, inside and outside, so you can have an accurate record. If somebody do break in and keep something, you can have accurate records and representation of who, so you can make reports and you can probably find the product. You have to meet GACP regulations, which is Good Agricultural Collection Practices for Medicinal Plants, which means that the place has to be very clean. If you go to one of those Jamaican outdoor farms, you see it. You see plastic spreading the whole ground and everything and whatnot. These things will cost a half acre about at the lowest cost, 30 to 40 to 50,000 US dollars. Right? At the lowest cost. And that is not checking your packaging, your tracking and monitoring regulation, where you have to tag each plant and track it and monitor it for a number of reasons, international reasons, and what happens if it's a product that is made from a plant goes bad. You have to have the batch numbers, just like with food and cosmetics, to track it to initiate recalls and withdrawal of product. Right? So it costs a lot of money to get in the industry. A half acre indoor facility can cost you anywhere between 600,000 to 1.2 million US dollars. Half an acre. Right? And then you hear people talking about, I'm going to grow 100 acres of this cannabis and make a lot of money. Let me explain to you. A half acre production facility can produce 100 pounds a week after the first round of cultivation. Right? If you do a perpetual grow operation and you stage your production, a half acre can produce 100 pounds a week. Where is all this going to go? Right? So far less demand, we say 100 acres. So that's what I say, there's a lot of dreams in the industry, and then there's the reality. The reality is it costs a lot to get into the industry, and a small man on the ground who, in his bank account, really has more than 10,000 US, right, cannot by himself or herself afford to get into this industry.
Okay.
So the way to do it is to come together. Go ahead.
Let me, again, I'm not giving up. What's to prevent the government from accepting a proposal? Maybe they decide they're going to grant 5 licenses in the first instance. To allow a cannabis cafe, right? So to use, they want to set up a dispensary cafe where persons can come and smoke or can use cannabis, and they can sell smoothies and sell things.
Use that word in the industry.
Huh?
Medicate.
Medicate, consume. What's to prevent if someone were to submit a proposal to a government? Because they can't speak because you, Kenya, and I are here having this conversation. What's to prevent them or the government from granting them a license, at least to create a safe space where residents or tourists can come I don't know, we can talk about their rights to sell, but people can bring from someplace else and consume in a safe place, a cannabis cafe. So what's to prevent the government from doing that?
Nothing preventing the government from initiating. They just want us to have a policy laid out in front of them. A white paper, a policy, eventually a bill to present to Parliament, and then to build their regulations. So as I said earlier, it's going to be a time-consuming process to get it all done properly. They cannot, without that, initiate licenses. They can, listen, their government, they can do what they want. Countries in Africa have done it, right? I've spoken to governments in certain countries in North Africa that have said to me, come and do what you want, we will give you a license, you just pay for it. And like, but you have no regulations, you have no law. They're like, no, you don't worry about that, you're good. What's the problem with that? The problem with that is that you can't do anything with it. You end up growing it, and it's been a problem. There's a lot of wealthy people that has gotten into those industries in those countries, and they need no money, right? One country in Europe, I wouldn't say which one again, in the beginning of their industry, because of bad regulation, they ended up with tons of cannabis that could not be sold anywhere. It's rotten and went down to the ground. So, yes, eventually, when the regulation is put in place, you will have a full array, or should have a full array of licenses. There should be some level of restriction. I misunderstood what you said earlier just now with the 5 licenses. I thought you meant 5 licenses in total, because that's a possibility. Look at Portugal, big developed country. 3 years they gave one Canadian company the only license in Portugal. And only after that company was able to grow and develop and export even, then they gave 6 Portuguese citizens licenses, then they went to 13, I think it's 13 now, right? We don't want to see that in our region. We don't want to see this monopoly. And believe me, there are companies that are trying actively to monopolize islands in our region. In fact, I think they've gotten into my country, so I'll continue fighting here. But so long as right regulation goes in place, nothing will prevent those things from happening. What I'm trying to explain is, as much as you will have a cultivation, extraction, infused products to make your brownies and so all the medical edibles, export, import, research and development, transport, dispensary, most important, where you can, again, yes, as you say, you can go in as a patient, meaning you've either gotten a recommendation or a prescription from your physician, preferably a recommendation, and preferably the government would split it so that it can be in line with best practices internationally. And then yes, you can go in, you can see a doctor, you can get a prescription, you can get a tourist, same thing, that's what Jamaica did. They allowed for physicians at the location itself. You go into Kaya in Jamaica, let's say, and you'd see a doctor in Kaya. 10 minutes later, you would be able to, if you're allowed and if the evaluation goes properly, which it usually does, you would be able to purchase your product and medicate and compound. And that takes care of the tourist aspect also, because tourists then have an easy way and access to medicine. It all comes down to regulation, guys, and what your government chooses in terms of putting the right regulation. They can move really quickly and say, okay, let's pick up Trinidad regulation. They now pass a bill, then we take that and put it into law. But Trinidad will have a lot of mistakes.
Correct.
And we don't want to follow the mistakes of other countries, and neither do we want to reinvent the wheel. So, I mean, fortunately for me, unfortunately, I don't know, there's consultants are necessary. The right consultation is necessary also. This is why I chose to become qualified in the field as opposed to saying, well, I just know about this ganja thing. No, right? There are qualifications in the field just like in every other career, and choosing the right consultant and getting the right thing done is imperative.
So assuming, Marcus, assuming that a government does everything that you were to recommend from a best of breed, best of purpose point of view, right, what do you see as the clear path and the quickest route to a medical cannabis industry?
Right, so the government has to quickly hire a consultant, myself or someone else, bring them on board to draw your primary legislation with your legislative drafters. Fortunately, we have legislation, I have legislation already that doesn't require the use of the drafters because it's been drafted by drafters, right, in other countries. So it makes it a little faster. And you know, it depends. Look, we had a meeting the other day, right, with you guys. I was sad to hear that the next meeting is a whole month later. And unfortunately, these are the way things happen in government. You know, a little country like St. Kitts, I sat with a CMO and a legislative drafter, and they were trying to make an appointment for us to make the next move on cannabis. And they checked their schedules, and they were like, okay, 2 months ahead. Like, no. I will run the 10 minutes to your office, from your office, and I will bring it together. And that's what I had to do, right? And we got it done in 2 days. You know, so sometimes you have to be able to break through the red tape, which is not always the easiest thing with governments, and put it in place. The important question I think that you need answered is when and if your government does the right thing and the right way, how many people are going to access the industry, right? And we just talked about the high cost of getting into the industry from a facility perspective. Again, even if the licenses were free, right? What is it going to cost to access this industry? The dispensary is the cheapest option, actually, because all you have to do is renovate a location to the regulatory standards of a pharmacy and hire a pharmacist. That in itself costs money because pharmacists are not cheap, right? So you have to be able to, in effect, open a pharmacy. How many small men can open a pharmacy now? Correct? What about inventory? If you're not growing it, just like a pharmacy, you're not producing the drugs. You have to buy inventory to start.
Yeah.
Right? Restaurants, business, any business, right? Any type of retail business. You guys will know because you have experience. So let me explain to your listeners. If you set up a little restaurant, a little one, right? It could cost you $15,000 US in stock. That's not your equipment. That's not your renovation of your place. That's just your first stock. What are you going to do as a dispensary? Are you going to buy 10 grams today and sell it today and 20 grams tomorrow and sell it tomorrow? No. You have to have capital. So the only way for the small man to get into any industry, including cannabis, is to come together. And unfortunately, coming together doesn't seem to be a regular practice with people, especially in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
And therefore, I think it needs to be forced. How? As I was explaining before while we were at the break, the social equity program needs to be implemented, whereby persons who cannot afford to get into the industry, whether the licensing process, whether the build out of the facility, whatever, you can't afford to get into the industry, or you're physically or mentally disabled to an extent where other work is hard to find, and you can find work in this industry. Those people should be able to apply to the authority for a special program, a social equity program. The authority, meaning the licensing authority, should then do the work of grouping these people together by location, right? Maybe in Dominica, with the size of your population, every 10 persons or so, every 12 persons, call them to a meeting, set them up, help them to register a business together as equal sharing partners, and then the government has to come into play now to say, well, okay, well, let us help these groups to establish themselves either by leasing them a plot of government land to do cultivation, charging them a small fee as opposed to large rent if they went into the private industry, then maybe issue the licenses for free initially and we get money when they become profitable, or some sort of program to the extent whereby each license can then help a majority of people as opposed to one or two.
So generically, the government is doing that for agriculture already with the Young Farmers Program, where they're giving young farmers land, they're giving them inputs, they're giving them even greenhouses and stuff, free of charge, giving it to them and telling them, we will then tell you exactly what to produce so that we can purchase it from you. So there is that. So if they were to extend that generically to cannabis, then that can work, correct?
Well, gentlemen, if you guys have such a progressive government in Dominica, I applaud you. And I applaud your government because even, and you'll hear my tones with it, I am politically oriented. Even in my country, Trinidad and Tobago, that's supposed to be the manufacturing hub of the region, right? The lowest electricity rate in the Western Hemisphere, right? Not just the region, in the Western Hemisphere. 3 cents US per kilowatt hour. Cheaper than if you were to produce it by solar, which costs 6 cents per US, 6 cents per kilowatt hour. We don't have a program in place whereby agriculture can be done in that regard, which I've been promoting for almost a decade. And it's exactly as you're saying, right? Because we have large food import bills, and we know exactly what we're importing. right? So if you were to, there's some programs, but there needs to be more investment, especially a country our size versus yours. So I do applaud that direction, and therefore it gives me hope that your government would do the right thing, especially after having a conversation in our meeting with your Honorable Attorney General. Hopefully your government would do the right thing and go the right direction in this industry and be able to produce an industry that is beneficial for the people, and that can work to the benefit of the island in itself. Now, it's not a panacea, it's not a cure-all, right?
No.
It's not going to be something that is going to, and I need your listeners to understand that it's not something that's going to save the country in terms of its economy or anything like that, but it can be a new diversified economy. It can be represent positive economic diversification and therefore allow for a lot more jobs, both skilled and unskilled, a lot more training into skilled positions even, and the potential to create an industry domestically at least that would be functional and feasible for the country. Export is something that, you all have a lot of green space, as I saw. But that's why I described the indoor and outdoor production earlier. A lot of countries are thinking in the region that we can produce outdoor and sell and export to the world. And indeed, some countries will purchase your outdoor for extraction purposes. But realistically, the demand on the international market is for indoor quality product. It's a total different quality. And then, at least for the flowers to be sold into the medicinal market in those export countries like Germany and Italy and so forth, those flowers have to be indoor. Why? Because outdoor you might find pests, right? And this is a sticky inflorescence. It's not like a cucumber that you could wipe it off, right? It's a sticky inflorescence where if in week 3 of flower it's this thick and an insect gets stuck in it and can't come out, by week 4 of flower, week 5 of flower, it gets covered in the flower. You can't see it. And if during the testing they test and find that insect, realistically, just like in food products, it's supposed to destroy that crop, right? So you have to be careful as to the availability to meet the regulations and costs to get into the industry. So I can't stress it enough that it's been questioned in every country from everyone. How does the small man benefit in this industry going forward, right?
Yeah.
Social equity programs, as I just described, is one of the best ways. Excessive concentration clauses that would prevent too few businesses from being open while preventing too many from being open at the same time. Something to prevent a monopoly and prevent destabilization of the industry through over-competition and over-saturation. All those things need to be implemented, and this is why, again, hopefully your government will choose to look at the right perspective in this legislation to move forward. But yes, there are methods to be used and implemented that will benefit the small man, will create an industry that will bring substantial revenue to the country and to the entrepreneurs that get into business. Not everyone that wants to do something can do it, right? It's not that they will be prevented, but it is something that, of course, financial restrictions restricts business on every level. Cannabis is not going to be any different. It is a consumable product, and therefore those regulations have to be met. And therefore, again, just like water, you're going to need a certain amount of capital to get into the industry. My advice for the small man listening and viewing on is that you need now to start getting yourself organized. This law is going to come. I can guarantee you that Dominica will implement this law sooner than later, right? Even if they were to take 1 year, 2 years in implementing, it is going to happen. I think from listening to your Honorable Attorney General that your government is decided, from what he said, to go forward, and right now it's just about the way to go forward. As a government, they of course being careful. They should be careful so that they don't trample upon any well-established rights, like the rights of physicians to prescribe, the rights of pharmacies to dispense, which is why we recommended the separation of medicinal cannabis into prescribable and non-prescribable, thereby upholding those well-established rights and making sure as a developing country, especially a smaller one, to keep in compliance with the international law so that banking will be available at some level at least, and something that won't prevent the industry from engaging in exports if they want to, and something that won't prevent you from gaining IMF loans and these things, or having issues with when you're applying for these things. So all these things need to be considered, and I think your government has started the right way by appointing the technical subcommittee. I want to give your fellow citizens hope that your government is on the right path already. Yes, they can go down or up or wherever it is from here, but yeah, they've started on the right path, definitely, right? They've sought the advice, and I think they've learned a lot from our last meeting. I would maybe you would even potentially send a copy of this to the Honorable Attorney General, so those questions that weren't answered in the meeting, I'm sure would have been answered today here in the program. I think everyone, I think a majority can benefit from the industry upcoming. I think once looked at realistically, it is simply a new product category and type that will come onto the market. It's not something, again, that should be looked at as a cure for all, something that will be overly beneficial to make millionaires and billionaires. It should be looked at as yet another regulated industry, something like alcohol. And if you think about it, realistically, it's closest to that in terms of the way it's used. If you were to close all the bars and pubs in your country and only allow a handful to open, that handful will make a lot of money. So it therefore needs to be regulated along that line. You know, you don't want too many businesses again, you don't want too few businesses, you want enough people to be able to engage and get into it from the right perspective. This traditional farmers thing that was applied in St. Vincent at St. Kitts is now seeking to apply with the same, in my opinion, not qualified consultant to deal with, and he's just taking and saying, here, take that, use that. Traditional farmers in St. Vincent is a thing, right? St. Vincent and Jamaica were the two islands in the Caribbean, and now the two islands in the Caribbean that produce illicitly for the entire region and more. And because of this, there were tons of traditional farmers. That's not the case in any of the other islands. St. Kitts, I went the length and breadth of the island, and I could only find less than 100 farmers, if you want to call it that, right? Whereas St. Vincent, as a small island, has easily 3,000 farmers. And Trinidad, as a big country, doesn't have that many cannabis farmers either. So we don't have and need the traditional farmers law or regulation. But what we can do is we can, like Barbados, tear the cultivation licenses down, whereby you can give someone a license for less than half an acre, right? And have them not have to get this large piece of land and all that. So they can engage in a small level of cultivation like they would do at home. And if your government is really that progressive, what it can do, especially that you all have a lot of forested space and you don't want people going onto public lands and cultivating for sale, is to, just like in St. Vincent, is to dedicate a space, you know, a large area of arable land and flatlands or so, or wherever that's not going to cause erosion and so downstream, and allow persons to lease for, you know, government type lease, small money, plots of that land to engage in their cultivation. Let the government do the fencing and the security and provide the security for it. Maybe we don't have to do fencing if they provide a police patrol to sit down there 24 hours. That will save them all the money in fencing if you put two guys in a jeep, right? And allowed to work like that, whereby persons now have the access to the space to cultivate. So if you are a small man out there and you can't afford to lease land, you can't afford to fence no land and all that stuff, maybe you can't even afford to buy the fertilizers and nutrients for the plants. Then maybe the government should set up something like this, like, as you said, they may be doing for food, and like I've been proposing in other places, whereby they set out the space, they plow the land and set out beds to grow and all this stuff. It will have to be outdoor. If, again, I've never heard of any government in the region now besides yours giving greenhouses. That is better for this industry because you will be able to produce a product even without using the supplemental lighting. You prevent the insects and you'll be able to produce a product that's much better quality and can be exportable without having to go onto the indoor market.
So,
definitely the way to go.
Marcus, we could go on forever, and I love your passion for the industry. You're the first person that I've come across that has both a healthy passion for it and has such an immense knowledge. But we are at the end of our time slot. Thank you very, very much for your advocacy. I'm sure I can say the same on Sam's behalf. And I think the listeners will find this presentation very useful. And I hope that as a byproduct, that this filters all the way up to those that have to take on the next stage of the process after we get through where we're at, to be able to ensure that Dominica learns from all of the mistakes of everyone else and takes all of the best from everyone else and puts something together that can become a model for cannabis being produced in a safe and hopefully productive manner.
Thank you, Marcus.
I couldn't have said it better myself. So guys, thank you for having me on the program. Yes, we did spend a lot of time, so I do also think it was hugely informative to your listeners. I know my answers would have focused heavily on the regulatory aspect of it. But I think that I'll tell you that's because I think we've already established that it is medicinally beneficial. I think we've already established that it can be and should be regulated as a medicine for sure. And I think now is just the time for your viewers and your listeners to understand that regulation and law is where it's at now. I'm not a lawyer or legal representative, so that's not why I'm for that. It's a matter of that is the direction that a country needs to take first, and that's the way that they're going now, thankfully. So again, hopefully it does reach the right ears, and hopefully your government, in the progressive nature it's in right now, goes forward with this industry in the right way. I do think Dominica will have a lot of success in this industry once things are done right.
Thank you very much.